Good morning, everyone. We're at 9:30, so the hearings can resume. We're here this morning to deal with matter 5, green infrastructure. But before we get onto that, there are a few things we need to go through. Carol, the housekeeping matters.
Good morning. As usual, there's no scheduled fire alarm tests for during the examination, so if the alarm does sound, please make your way to the nearest exit and gather on the corner of Claremont Terrace outside the GMB building, which is just to your left as you go out of the main door. Do not stop to retrieve any belongings, but exit the building as quickly and safely as possible following the green fire exit routes. And do not enter the building until a fire marshal or member of the fire service tells you it's safe to do so. The main doors are at the front of the building, and for security, please do not use the side doors unless you're a wheelchair user and someone is available to unlock and relock the door after you. Just to also let you know that there are other users in the building, so from a security point of view, just bear that in mind. The toilets are situated along that corridor at the side of the main hall. There's drinking water available around the table, and if anybody's in the foyer, in the gallery, water is available in the foyer. There are other available refreshments at various shops and places in Gillygate and also Sainsbury Express in Bootham. Just to also remind people that the sessions are being filmed. So if you have any issues about being recorded, can you let me know? I can put you in a location where you won't be picked up on camera. And the Wi-Fi details, Citadel Guest with the password is General Booth 1883, and the details are on the posters either side of the building alongside my contact details. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Now, as I said, we're here to do green infrastructure this morning. Matter 5. There are a number of policies at issue here, from GI1 through to GI7, with a GI2A having been inserted now. I do have the list of modifications, so I think most or all of these policies have been modified to some extent by the Council, so I hope you're all aware of that. If not, we can deal with it as it crops up. I'm going to ask if we can recognise most of you, but it might be worth some introductions. Mr. Henderson.
So yes, Matthew Henderson on behalf of the City of York Council.
Good morning, Laura Bartle, Principal Planner with City Council.
Good morning, Tom Robinson, JLL, on behalf of IPIF.
Good morning, Neil Jones, Consultant at Rapley's, representing British Sugar.
Good morning, everyone. Stuart Natkus, Barton Wilmore, on behalf of Barrett David Wilson Homes.
Sarah Worthington from Erdin Planning on behalf of Mr Harrison.
Tim Bewley, KC, as I must now get used to calling myself, for Defence Infrastructure Organisation. The name badge is wrong, but maybe I don't think that's...
Don't worry, I can't see it anywhere without my glasses.
Okay.
Thank you.
Rose Hilton, Heslington Parish Council.
Richard Bramley, Heslington Parish Council.
Thank you. I think I've read the hearing statements, obviously, in preparation for this morning, and wondered about the best way to structure it, but I couldn't come up with anything more radical than going through the policies in order. So I'm going to start with GI1, but I don't know, Mr. Henderson, whether you wanted to make an all-encompassing introduction that would suit.
No, I don't. We don't have any overarching submissions. Each of the points taken is fairly specific to different parts of the policy, and we'll deal with them in turn. Perhaps if it assists, I will ask Ms Bartle to introduce each policy and to explain what the modifications are, and that can then be the starting point for the discussion that follows.
That's most helpful. Shall we start with GI1 then? Go ahead.
Certainly, yes. So GI1 is the Council's overarching policy, which is intended to sit alongside the other policies within that chapter and provides, as I say, that kind of overarching framework that sets that broad context and is intended to then flow into the detailed policies within the chapter. There is a modification that's proposed, relatively minor, but just makes clear that those overarching objectives that are expressed in the policy are to be considered where it's appropriate and with reference to the other policies in the plan and for the reasons that I've explained.
That's clear, thank you. Does anyone have anything they want to say about GI 1 as modified? Mr. Bramley, go on.
In the draft local plan, page 28, 3.6, CUIC states that nationally and locally significant nature conservation sites will be excluded when considering future development locations. That's on page 28 of the draft local plan, paragraph 3.6. So then the first thing they do is nominate ST15, which includes several sink sites very close to the SSSI as one of the biggest sites they're going to do. So they seem to have contradicted the policy they've originally stated in their aspirations. Thank you.
Is that, I wonder, is that something amiss with policy GI1, or is that a general criticism of the allocation of ST15?
Well, I think it's all part of the green infrastructure that we're meant to be talking about today.
Understood. What does the council say to that?
Needless to say, so we disagree. If and insofar as there is any issue, it's a site-specific issue that goes to the site that's been referred to. In any event, does this go to the soundness of GI1 or indeed the soundness of the allocation? Stepping outside of what we're considering today, the answer is no, it doesn't. What you've been pointed to is a single sentence in some explanatory text. You haven't been pointed to any part of a policy. We've gone through in great detail and elsewhere, not only in the sustainability appraisal, but also subsequently the allocation, why it's been adopted, and the approach that we have adopted in that regard, and the fact that there may, and I don't accept there is, but even if I assume that there is an inconsistency, do we need to make any change with soundness? No, we don't. Will we go away and consider whether we strike through that sentence? Yes, I'm happy to do that. But that's as far as I am prepared to go today.
Mr. Bramley?
Yeah, can I just add that there's no evidence that they've considered alternative sites that is acceptable at the moment to Heslington Parish Council?
Right.
So that's a criticism, I think, of the essay. We've been over that ground. I don't propose to reopen it now. You've heard all of our submissions on that.
Okay, Ms. Hilton?
I just wanted to check, really, because Mr. Henderson said that this was about a specific allocation and therefore couldn't be discussed at this point. What is the point where we could discuss, for example, OS 10? Because it is part of the green infrastructure, and I think when we were discussing ST15 in phase 3, we were told it was to be discussed in the green infrastructure, and now we're being told it's to be discussed, it should have been discussed as part of ST15. So I'm just a bit confused about when we can discuss the implications of OS 10. Thank you.
I'm certainly not going to cut across discussion if that's what was said at the previous hearing session. I wasn't here. but yeah, let me know what is it that you want to discuss? What do you want to cover?
Well, in our hearing statement, I think we make it clear that we have a lot of concerns about OS 10. The general approach of GI1 to green infrastructure doesn't seem as sound as it could be. For example, that agricultural land is a major component of green infrastructure. Although OS 10, for example, is described as open space, the OS bit, it isn't going to be open to the public if it is going to be a mitigation site for the impact of ST15, but it is currently an open space in the same sense that it is completely open. It's just that it's an agricultural area rather than a wetlands nature conservation area. And in addition, for the last 9 years or so, farmers were being encouraged through the CYC Biodiversity Action Plan to get involved with stewardship schemes to promote biodiversity. And there's been a very successful stewardship scheme running on that OS 10 land for 9 years, which Natural England has applauded. And those 9 years of public funding for that will be wasted. Moreover, the process of creating a nature conservation area, plus all the construction disturbance related to ST15, will inevitably harm the bird and animal life that already exists there. On top of that, there will be a huge carbon release. And this, again, is contrary to one of the purposes of GI1, which is aiding resilience to climate change. So we know that some carbon is released when fields are ploughed, but we're talking here about removing all of the topsoil to create the OS 10 mitigation site. And this will release large quantities of carbon. Moreover, the link road, as proposed in the Statement of Common Ground, cuts across 2 woodlands, requiring about 0.1 of a hectare of established woodland to be felled. Not only that, but breaking up the airfield, which is, as everyone knows, a very, very thick extent of concrete, will also release a huge amount of carbon. And we're still waiting to know exactly how many hectares of currently productive, best and most versatile farmland will be taken out for the link road to ST15, between ST15 and the A64. So there's already a significant detriment to the carbon zero ambitions of with ST15. It's releasing carbon from current carbon sinks. There'll be increased carbon emissions. And as we already discussed on Tuesday in Matter 7, Transport and Air Quality this week, the carbon emissions will emanate from the construction process, and also longer term, there'll be higher emissions from the increased traffic. The NPPF Para 175 indicates that land should be allocated with the least environmental or amenity value. So we're suggesting that other options might be preferable. For example, well, just to avoid this site and instead consider biodiversity offsetting off-site, and that is allowed by the new environmental bill. Or perhaps nearby, think about using the adjacent Weldrake Wood as mitigation area, which is a recent plantation, and it's coniferous woodland, which is not considered to be of high ecological value. ST15 sits in an existing corridor of stepping stones for nature conservation and biodiversity. And the proposal, although it might serve to mitigate the lower Doos and Derwent, at the same time will be destroying the network of nature conservation of which OS10 now, as it stands now, and ST15 and the SYNC and SSSI sites nearby form a significant part. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Hilton. So I'm reading that as a concern about ST15 as in principle.
I think on the whole, I'm representing the people of Heslington Parish. We're not opposed to ST15 as such, except that it's gone on to greenfield sites. But on the whole, I think we're not specifically opposed to ST15, and I hope my colleagues will correct me if I'm wrong. But it's the surrounding infrastructure and the surrounding destruction of hundreds and hundreds of hectares of food-producing land, plus the problems that we were discussing on Tuesday of the changes to the whole of that southeast region of the Heslington Parish. So we don't automatically object to ST15 in itself, but it's the implications of everything that surrounds it which is going to be so destructive.
So I wonder if Ms Hilton can help me. What's the change that is being proposed in the interests of soundness?
I'm not a professional planner, Mr Henderson, as you know, so you would have to tell me about what is a soundness reason and what's not a soundness reason. I'm afraid I can't answer that, but I've made some suggestions from Heslington Parish about other options that could have been considered. Whether they have been, we don't know, because there's no evidence that they have been.
That might mean, if I can assist, I think, and do correct me if I'm wrong, that ST15 could have been brought forward in a different way. It could have been smaller. It could compensate for its biodiversity impacts in a different way, perhaps. The level of infrastructure might have been lower. There are all sorts of things, but it's not an. It's an objection that ranges from. Well, it's not quite an in-principle objection, but there are objections to the way it's put forward by the council, as in the ways that I've sort of explained. Yes, sort of explained.
In our original statement in the consultation of whenever it was, 2018, 2019, the original consultation for this draft local plan, we did definitely object to ST15, and that was, as you say, mainly for all of the reasons surrounding it, as we tried to spell out.
Mr. Brownlee?
Yeah, the new Environment Bill, I believe it gives the council the opportunity to have these offsets off-site. And the council have actually purchased a farm, I think, within the last 2 years. Why don't they use their own farm to do it instead of the best and most versatile agricultural land, which is now producing food? If this site goes ahead at the moment, there won't be one scrap of food produced on OS10. Right now, it's some of the best and most versatile land, and it's sustainable farmed at the moment. And we do look after our soils. We do it. We try to less soil disturbance and do cover cropping and companion cropping, and we do all the most up-to-date sustainable things we can, yet produce food. Thank you.
All I would say is that when a council is producing a plan, it does have to balance a number of different issues, and it does have to meet its housing requirements unless there are very good reasons not to. So it does have to find an environmentally acceptable way of doing that. So you know, the council can't think about one aspect at the expense of everything else. It has to balance all these plates that are spinning at the same time. So I don't know if that assists, Mr. Henderson.
So it does. I hear everything you say, and I'm grateful for that. I think all of that, though, goes to the nature and form of ST15. It doesn't go to any requirement for you to make a change to the policies that we're considering today in the interests of soundness.
Okay.
So that, I think, is the headline submission. In terms of the detail, I would point you back to the Statement of Common Ground, Appendix 2 in respect of ST15, which does deal in quite some detail with the issue of biodiversity, the approach that has been taken in respect of biodiversity, and ST15. The Council has recognised the arable land around ST15. That's not been obscured or hidden or overlooked. But as you alluded to, that is part and parcel of the balancing exercise and the appraisal that you see in the sustainability appraisal as sites are selected and come forward. On the specific point about biodiversity net gain, Ms Bartle will look at that in a moment. All I would say is in terms of the general approach, one looks first on site or in the local area before then going off site. But Ms Bartle will deal specifically with ST15 in that regard.
Yeah, just to say that in that Statement of Common Ground, Appendix 1 that Mr Henderson referred you to, it does make clear that the intentions for delivering those net gains do exceed the minimum 10% that will be required once the Act is enforced. The other point to be mindful of is that the value of off-site contributions and net gains are diminished by their distance. So in principle, Mr Bramley is correct that we could consider further off-site provision, but the purpose here is to deliver it as close as possible to the site to achieve better overall outputs.
And so on the point about the sink, which I think was bound up in all of that, you'll see that's expressly addressed in that appendix. The impact, the potential impact on the sink. In essence, the position that is ultimately reached, as Ms Bartle has foreshadowed, is one which is an improvement over the current situation rather than any sort of net detriment. There was a net improvement.
Can I just ask, just a point of clarification? I'm taking OS10 to be this patch of open space marked on the proposals map next to ST15.
Yeah, yes, that's correct.
Okay. Just. All right. So that's OS10. The Tilmire is
correct. Yes, yes. So that there are also some minor modifications to the policies map OS10 that were proposed as part of the Phase 3 modifications that came through. But in essence, it doesn't divert significantly from what's shown on the map that you're looking at. It's just to note that there were some minor modifications to the southern-west boundary that came forward.
So if I mean, forgive me because I wasn't at the hearing session. I have talked to my colleague about it, obviously, but just for the purposes of this morning, ST15 covers part of the sink, which is the airstrip. So what's going on here is meant to compensate for any impact on that and any impact on this.
Indeed, yes.
Forgive the pointing.
Yes, that's quite right. And it will also provide some of the biodiversity net gain requirements, some of which will be delivered on the ST15 site itself, but some will also be part of the OS10 delivery.
That's helpful. I just wanted to be very clear about that in my own mind. Go on.
Just to clarify, I believe the OS10 mitigation site is mitigation for the Lower Derwent site, on the other side of ST15 rather than for the sink.
Right. Can you help with that, Ms. Barsall?
So the short answer is no, that's not the full picture. OS 10 is part of the mitigation for the sink as well. I refer you back to Appendix 2 to that Statement of Common Ground, paragraph 3.1 and following, but 3.1 deals with this specifically, retention of the western part of the sink and the habitat creation within OS 10, combined with appropriate long-term management, will comfortably mitigate for the loss, and that loss includes the loss of the sink that's been described. When you read on, you will see that the judgment that is reached there is actually through that management process. It's anticipated that it could attain a suitably high standard that could be designated as a sink itself. So that is what is intended. That's 3.1 through to 3.5.
In Quad's response to MIQs, the quota survey carried out by Peak Ecology, and it started from a very low ecological value of the land in OS 10. Presumably they used the Natural England metric 3.1 to assess this, but there's no real details about how that assessment was carried out, and there's no showing how it was calculated. So I dispute that. And also, metric 3.1 hasn't yet been adopted. It's still under consultation. And just a final point on the metric, which a lot of weight's been put on this, so it's very important. It should not be applied to compensate for impacts on irreplaceable landscape features, which was, when the metric was released, that was the Natural England press release. So I could say it is maybe compensating for irreplaceable landscape features such as all the land on the airfield, which has built up a big assemblage of skylarks. You're trying to compensate for that feature by OS 10. So you're going against the guidance for using the metric.
Let me take a couple of points on that. Yes, DEFRA metric 3.1, see paragraph 5.1 of Appendix 2 to the Statement of Common Ground, that was used. No, I don't think, from a very quick scan in response to the point made, that it includes the full calculation of that. Does it need to? No, it doesn't, for the purposes of the assessment that is being undertaken through the examination of this plan. And then finally, on the irreplaceable habitats point, I'm not clear what irreplaceable habitat is being identified having regard to the definition in the NPPF in this case. So if that can be clarified, then we can look at it.
It was landscape features, wasn't it, Mr.
Well, I would suggest the whole Elvington airfield plus the grass on it is an irreplaceable landscape feature, which is, over the years, it's been irreplaceable as a corridor for wildlife, joining the Triple SI up to the Lower Derwent Valley sites. It's the openness of it which is critical to ground nesting birds.
So I think on the basis of what we've just heard, the short answer is that's all been taken into account as part of the essay. I refer you back to the analysis that you have there. And I don't propose to go back through that. Mr. Elvin's already done it at quite some length.
Well, just to add, this is new guidance, so as we're doing modifications as we go along, it maybe should be taken into account.
What do you suggest, Mr. Bramley, that perhaps the ecological impacts should be looked at again?
We need to go into it in more detail, I think, before we accept these figures. And somebody's just been on OS 10 and said it's of low ecological value, and that's all we've got. So there's a low baseline, so anything's going to be better than that, really, as it's been produced. Whereas I'm arguing that at the moment it's quite high ecological value by being in a stewardship scheme for actually 15 years now.
clearly these are matters that we're going to have to take into account when we look at the plan and soundness of the plan. But it strikes me that it doesn't necessarily bear on policy GI1 as it's presented and as it's been proposed to be modified. It's more of an impact on or has more relevance towards the way that the council has gone about selecting sites and how it's dealt with its housing requirement while balancing ecological matters. Is that fair?
I think maybe the approach to green infrastructure should be taken into consideration when we sort of consider the NPPF, the best and most versatile land and the benefits of that, which I maintain that's how the plan should go around that. I think more weight maybe should be put on producing food as looking at birds, personally.
Fair point. Yep. Thank you.
I think those matters are in the essay. You've heard there's a disagreement as to essentially weight and balance and judgment. I don't need to say anything more about that. Save to note, it's been taken into account. A soundness issue doesn't arise as a result.
Mr. Merritt, you want to ask about GI1? Go ahead.
Yes, Dave Merritt speaking on behalf of York Environment Forum and York Labour Party. As you will have seen from our written statement, we were supportive of the rather more extensive Civic Trust submission, which as a Civic Trust member I have had a limited degree of involvement in. So it's been particularly contributed to by a ecologist colleague, and we were concerned that we, in terms of a number of aspects, but I think the key issue for us is the deliverability of these sets of policies, and refer to the Civic Trust's concern about the out-of-dateness of the evidence base, but also some lack of clarity in the proposed G1 policy. And specifically, I'd point you to the highlighted sections of the Civic Trust's submission on page 5, where they make the point that the policy needs to be rewritten to make a clearer separation between the types of habitats that it considers, which need different types of responses, as is required by the NPPF, but they also advocate in terms of deliverability that there should be a biodiversity audit policy, a new policy, linked to a biodiversity action plan, so that the council has a clear, thought-out approach to how it then deals with specific applications that come forward. So, as I say, I draw your attention to those particular issues, which I think are of importance, which is the reason that we came out in support of the Civic Trust submission.
Thank you, Mr. Merritt.
Thank you. Yes, just in response to those comments. Firstly, insofar as the suggestion that the evidence that we're relying upon is out of date, I think the council would accept that some of that material needs to be updated, but importantly, it's doing that within a changing context of the Environment Act and the provisions within it, and the requirement for nature recovery strategies, all of which are being worked through and are not directly material to this local plan at this stage. The policies, policy GI1 doesn't make specific reference to the audit and the action plan that Mr. Merritt refers to, but GI2 does, and so there is an express requirement within that at criterion 5. Well, originally it's 2 in the plan that you're looking at, sir. As modified, it's 5. There is a a requirement in there for consideration to be given to the Biodiversity Action Plan, and so we would say that it's dealt with there. The other point that's raised with regards to the, I think the suggestion was that the confused mix of habitats that are referred to in the policy. I think the position is that the things that are listed in paragraph 9.3 do all cut across green infrastructure issues. And as I set out at the beginning of our discussion on this is an overarching policy with the intention that separate policies deal with those particular matters. So we're content that it's sufficient in that regard.
And so on the hierarchy point and the suggestion of in-transition to the NPPF, we don't accept that. We refer you to the modifications to GI2, which actually deal up front and centre with the hierarchy of sites, the mitigation hierarchy as well, and the approach the Council will take to European sites, national sites, local sites, etc., each dealt with in turn. And that, in my submission, is entirely consistent with the NPPF.
Is it the situation that we touched on the other day? I can't remember which day which day it was, where you have to have an overarching policy, has to be flexible enough. So it's best if it's not too specific, and then allow policies underneath it to feed into it. Is that what we're looking at here?
Yes, that's exactly how this is intended. Yes, as we've dealt with some of the other development management issues, the same similar sort of tiered approach is taken there.
Was there anything you wanted to add?
Just coming back on the biodiversity audit and action plan, again, I'd come back to the representation that they would be best separated into two clauses so as to actually make issues rather more clear in terms of the two different sets of issues that need to be addressed via them. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think I can leave that with the Council. I'm not sure it goes to soundness, but it may be that they could be separated out without too much difficulty, but I don't know whether you think that would add anything.
I'm not entirely clear that where the separation in GI1 would occur.
No,
it wouldn't be in GI1.
Oh, we're in GI2. Oh, right.
I think. Yeah, forgive me.
I'm sorry.
My apologies for crossing over the two.
So we'll consider it. It's not a soundness issue. If we want to make that change, we'll do so in due course, but I'll go no further to say.
Does anyone else have anything on GI1 to touch on? Because I think we're naturally moving into GI2. GI2 then. Go ahead.
Thank you. There's a point on, excuse me, sinks, covered in GI2, originally in point 1, now as amended in point 4. They're a non-statutory designation, and as a result, they don't have quite the same body of guidance and technical support as a SSSI or international site might. So we rely on the guidance that's available. DEFRA, for the local sites guidance, suggests a review every 5 to 10 years. And the most recent one is 2017, which is document SD 081 of the evidence. So due an imminent update, or an update sometime between now and 5 years hence. But in policy GI2, there's not a mechanism for dealing with disagreements or disputes on designation for sinks. There's a mechanism for developing a sink site or a site that would have a development that would have an impact on a sink where there's overriding need in the area and yeah, the need outweighs the designation, but there's not a mechanism for disputing or de-designating a sink where appropriate. The glossary and the evidence base talks about a mechanism for how sinks would be designated, but not how they could be de-designated. And to flesh this out with a real-world example, the site that our client owns is a brownfield site that was assessed to be a sink in the past. We've had 2 surveys, botanical surveys, undertaken by 2 separate ecologists that both conclude, one was in December 2018, published or issued in 19, and one this summer, both of which conclude that the site doesn't meet the designation for a sink site. But there's no way of disputing that, or there's no way set out in the plan for managing that disagreement and that dispute. And I think it would be helpful if there were one. As I say, this site's a brownfield site. It's on the edge of an employment area and residential area. There's no other designations. It's inside the development limit. It'd make, I would suggest, a good contribution potentially to either residential or employment development. But we can't get around this sink issue. So it would make I think it'd be a useful addition to either the policy or to the supporting wording to come up with a means of at least discussing and reviewing sink criteria.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Mr. Henderson.
Yeah, sir, thank you. So the short answer is no, we don't need to make an amendment to include any provision. You'll note that the local plan neither allocates nor deallocates sinks. That's dealt with entirely separately to the local plan. What this policy is concerned with doing is affording the correct level of protection to those sinks once they have been so designated. So there's simply no need as a matter of soundness to have any part of this policy amended to include the mechanism that has been suggested. Ms Bartle will deal, insofar as is necessary, with the more site-specific point that's been made.
Yes, understand the point that's being raised, but the issue of not being able to develop the site is one which I disagree with, on the basis that the policy, the clause relating directly to sites where sinks are either directly or impactly affected, does provide scope for development, provided that those impacts are adequately dealt with. So to a degree, regardless of whether the site is categorised as a sink or not, the existing habitat and ecological qualities of the site would need to be given regard anyway, and the site could come forward in either case. The policy doesn't expressly prohibit development on sites which are allocated as sinks.
Mr. Robinson.
Thank you. I'd only add that the starting point is, for a site that's considered to be a sink, is there's a higher barrier to overcome. And then, so you'd bring forward a development proposal and have to demonstrate that this sink category could be overcome. But if we disagree in the first place that it's a sink, it should be a lower starting point. And it's, as I say, brownfield site, an opportunity to develop within the development limits.
Looking at the policy as it's written, the modified policy subsection 4 to GI2, isn't it right that if a proposal came forward for that site with an ecological assessment that says there was no great ecological value and insufficient value to warrant designation as a sink, then wouldn't the sort of compensatory measures that the policy would require be somewhat reduced? So if you put it in as a package, I'm not explaining that very well, but you'll understand, I hope, what I'm suggesting as to what a way forward might be within the realms of that policy clause.
I can absolutely see what you're saying, yes, but it seems an unnecessary burden to a higher starting point that another site next door that hasn't been classified as a sink wouldn't have to meet.
Go on.
I'm not entirely sure that it would be a higher starting point, because the starting point would be the assessment, the baseline assessment of what's on the site at the moment. And the assessment overall would be a balancing one. As we've heard from Mr. Robinson, it's a brownfield site, and the benefits that lend itself to such a development would weigh in favour of the site's overall development when considered against any harm, if there were any. And we've seen and we've heard that there is poorer quality ecological value than perhaps the sink designation might suggest, in which case that's the starting point. So I don't see that the policy requires modification to deal with that issue.
Thank you. Was there anything else?
No, thank you. I do appreciate the clarifications, and I think perhaps assists in our better understanding, and we'll keep the emerging policy under review, of course. But thank you.
I think the issue would be how you presented the baseline, and that would affect the workings of that particular clause 4 or criterion 4. Anything else on GI 2, Ms. Hilton?
Thank you. Yes, does policy GI2 deal with biodiversity and access to nature in a reasonable way? We think not. And I'm going to use examples from the area that we know, because that's what we know. So the area southeast of Heslington Village, for example, there needs to be more separation between recreational routes and sites of high biodiversity. Otherwise, neither biodiversity nor recreation will be protected. So some examples. Dog walking. Mr. Elvin convincingly argued in phase 3 in relation to Strenswell Common, which is SS19, that routinely dog walkers walk for an hour or for more than a kilometre. He convinced us of it. And therefore, the presence of a large new settlement will bring a large new population of dogs onto Heslington Tilmar SSSI, as well as the proposed OS10 mitigation site, if that goes ahead, and the airfield sink. This will inevitably disturb ground nesting birds and other wildlife, as well as affecting the necessary flora that supports them. Mr. Elvin explained that a SSSI is a lower degree of protection than a spa or Ramsar site. I understand that. My difficulty is that I don't think the ground nesting birds are completely up to speed on this, and I'm sure that the dogs won't be. The end result will be a great deal of disturbance on what is a SSSI, specifically for ground nesting birds and specifically for particular kinds of sedge. On top of that, we've got another form of recreation in the form of wheels. So leisure cyclists and mountain bikers, not to mention unauthorised motor vehicles, will, under the present local plan, have easy access to these sensitive sites. And the combination is a recipe for failure. We have made suggestions of remedies to this. Considering the level of harm to an ecologically sensitive site that unrestrained domestic pet and cycle access can cause. We suggest that, firstly, suitable alternative natural green spaces, SANGs, should be a bigger part of ST15, and bigger sites, of course. But we think as well that clever, imaginative planning should actively discourage dog walking and cycling on routes that lead directly to sensitive ecological areas, rather than promoting them, as is the case at the moment. I want to refer back to the discussion on transport and air quality that we had two days ago, where Mr. Griffiths, you very helpfully gave guidance about avoiding very prescriptive routes, and you've said it again today about avoiding detail. And I think we reached a point on Tuesday where Mr. Ridge of the Council concurred that in the clause 13 of SS13, that's the ST15 site, there was a far too prescriptive detail of cycle routes along the lanes. So I'd like to suggest that that whole clause 13 is removed from SS13. There is already a later clause, I think it was 17, which would provide the council with much more flexibility and the opportunity to really separate out protection of biodiversity from recreational access. And I believe the Civic Trust hearing statement for today's matter, which is on the website, EXHSP4M5GI5, page 5, says something very similar about the separation of the type of recreational space, whether it's for field-based sports, for water-based activities, for recreational space such as exercising animals, or for recreational space focused on enjoyment of biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Hilton. I'll come to the council first.
So let's deal firstly with the local concern about the dog walkers that you heard expressed and the triple SI. That's expressly being taken into account. I refer, for example, to ST15, Statement of Common Ground. If you look at Appendix 2 to that document, at 4.1, it deals with this issue, 4.1 through to 4.5. I summarise very briefly, but it's looked at potential increase in visitor pressure on the triple SI as well as the SPA. It's looked at the mitigation that is provided through informal recreation, and in short, that mitigation is sufficient to reduce the numbers to an acceptable level, and you've got the references within those paragraphs to the HRA that looked at that in respect of those European sites. So on the specific local concern, that I think is all that needs to be said. That doesn't give rise to any need to modify the policy before you, GI2. Equally, I'd resist the suggestion that we need to modify policy SS13, all the more so out of something arising in the session today without the promoter being on notice. It's rare for the council to say there's a procedural issue, but I put that as the context. In any event, you will see there have been proposed changes to that policy, including on the parts that I think were referred to by Ms Hilton, and that's in the schedule of modification. So no need as a matter of soundness, certainly not on what you've heard today, to make any amendments to the plan.
So it's not necessarily a need to modify or further modify GI2?
Correct. And in fact, what the modification that was proposed, as I heard it, was to SS13.
Well, I'm happy to leave that with you, but of course, if and when an application for ST15 came before the council, I mean, there's a lot of ifs and buts before that, so forgive me, but if and when an application for that site came forward, then it would have to be judged against not only policy SS13, if it was in place, but also policy GI1 and policy GI2, wouldn't it? So there would be a sort of crossing between that would need to be considered by the council. Is that fair?
Indeed, yes. And those recreational impacts that Ms Hilton described would be further assessed against a more concrete proposal. And what the evidence we've done in collaboration with the landowners so far has achieved is demonstration that there are suitable mechanisms in place to ensure that those impacts can be avoided or mitigated or compensated for where necessary. And that process is ongoing and iterative as those development proposals for ST15 get further refined.
Thanks. One's heart slightly sinks at the thought of having to go all through this again with every application, but I suppose what I was trying to do was avoid that by getting it right now. And just to pick up on what Mr Henderson complained about being a procedural matter, I was really reiterating what had already been said with Mr Waring from Quad and Mr Ridge from CYC 2 days ago. I wasn't making a new idea, I was just reiterating something that had already been discussed, and as far as I'm concerned, it was agreed that that particular clause was too prescriptive. Not agreed, but it was proposed by the council and by ourselves.
Well, sir, I'm very grateful for the clarification. If I misunderstood, I don't need to go any further, and you've heard what's been said before.
It was discussed the other day. I might have to go back into my note to find out exactly where we ended up on it. There was a lot discussed that day, but yes, I do think you're right, Ms Hilton.
I think if you look at the video, Mr Ridge said, "I concur." That sounds to me like an agreement. So just to pick up as well on the Statement of Common Ground reference to recreational dog walking, domestic pets, I don't have the wording in front of me now. I know that that is written in there. I agree with Mr Henderson. There is something in there about it, but I'm disputing whether it is anything like enough, because Mr Henderson's colleague, Mr Elvin himself, went on at length about dog walking, and I'm picking up on that and saying the same rule applies to the SSSI as to Strensall Common in terms of how far dog walkers will walk with their dog. It's only a kilometre from ST15 to the SSSI. That's what, 10 minutes walk? And most people with dogs, apparently, I don't have a dog, but I'm learning. Apparently, people with dogs will tend to walk for an hour quite regularly. So that's what I'm picking up on. I don't disagree that there's something been written about it, but it doesn't go nearly far enough. Thank you.
Well, sir, I think we can make a couple of short points. One, there's no inconsistency between the submissions you've heard from Mr Elvin and what I've said today, or indeed what is in the Statement of Common Ground. You will see on your no doubt close study of the Statement of Common Ground that it does deal with these mechanisms. So it's not simply a case of, I don't mean this disrespectfully, measuring the distance and then saying there's a problem, because the Statement of Common Ground looks at, well, what are the alternative recreational spaces? And specifically on this point and in respect to the European sites, the HRA does deal with this in detail. Its conclusion, so it's CYC 45, and the relevant conclusion is at paragraph 6.1.12, dealing specifically with the sorts of concerns about recreational pressures, urban edge effects that you've just heard expressed to you. So I don't accept there's any absence of detail, much less that any such absence of detail would go to an issue of soundness.
Thank you, Mr Henderson.
This is not a European site, so it wouldn't be covered by that. But as I said earlier, I don't think the ground nesting birds are completely aware of that.
To be very clear, I fully appreciate the SSSI is in a European site. See Regulation 8, I think it is, of the 2017 regulations. The point I was making is that the Statement of Common Grounds looks at both the SSSI and the European sites that are relevant. And in respect of those European sites, I've pointed you to the HRA, which obviously considers those directly, and I've given you the reference to it.
I'm right, I think, if I say that if and or when an application came forward so that there was more detail about what was proposed, those matters would have to be considered again.
Correct.
I mean, we're considering them at a local plan stage, which is a sort of notional stage, but once there's more detail, they'd have to be thought through.
Precisely
further.
so. Plans or projects, the magic words in the habitats regulations. We're dealing here with the first of those, the plan stage. And you're entirely right, the project stage, the development, the application stage, those provisions will kick in again.
I understand the points that are made here, but I'm not seeing anything to suggest that further changes to GI2 are required to deal with any of these matters.
Yeah, just in response to Mr Henderson saying that mitigation would prevent recreational disturbance on the Tilmire, the Minster Way goes through Tilmire, and all the Tilmire is open access land. And the council are promoting cycling and walking, which goes through open access land, including onto Fordlands Road at Fulford. So I don't see any means that any mitigation measures can be possibly be effective, unless they're going to stop the Minster Way.
I don't know if that's a matter for detailed consideration in if and when that came forward. I mean, it clearly would have to be considered, wouldn't it?
Precisely so, sir. And I think what you're being referred to doesn't sound like it's a project or matter that's part of the plan. It may be another council initiative, but does that give rise to any issue for you today? No, it doesn't.
Is there anything else on GI2? Mr Merritt?
Yes, can I welcome the further modifications that the Council has proposed for GI2, which I think are all helpful. I think in terms, covers to a degree some of the issues that the Environment Forum raised. I think the one issue is closed bodies of waters, ponds and so on, which still doesn't seem to have been addressed. We would welcome if the policy could be tweaked in that regard.
So we noted that comment in the hearing statement. And we don't consider it necessary for a reason of soundness to make specific reference to ponds. The policy as a whole requires consideration of areas with biological qualities, of which in some cases ponds will be a part of. It's not considered appropriate or necessary to make specific reference to it. As I say, the policy particularly Part 5 captures all features of biological interest.
It talks about retain irreplaceable habitats, including ancient woodland and veteran trees.
Apologies. So it's the confusion of the old modified numbering.
Oh, 6.
So it would be 6. Yeah, sorry. It's actually, shown wrong on my note. So, yeah.
Retention, enhancement and appropriate management of features of geological or biological interest. So what you've done is kept the definition wide so that something like ponds could come under that definition along with many other things.
Indeed, yeah. Any other habitat that's of similar importance, yes.
Can Can I draw your attention to para 9, as it has been renumbered, where other types of water, flowing water, bodies are dealt with, but so if you are going to cover flowing water, why are we not going to cover non-flowing water? And seems illogical to leave them out. Bullet point 9, the amended bullet point 9.
Well, forgive me, but I haven't got an amended bullet point 9 on my schedule, my consolidated schedule of changes. I'm only going up to 8.
I believe it's the one that starts, maintains and enhances the rivers, banks, floodplains that Mr Murrett's referring to.
So yeah, so I read,
and the one underneath.
I read these as insertions and then go back into the policy as written. I've got it.
It's, if it's easier, at the back of our matter statement, there is the composite version.
So I was quoting from the Council's written submission. Yes.
Was there anything you wanted to add?
Only insofar as to say that those points, criterion that Mr Murrett refers to are dealing with more broader matters associated with those bodies of water as opposed to specific habitat importance, which I think he was referring to. So we maintain the position that we don't see it necessary to include those in the way that we don't make specific reference to other types of habitat, terrestrial or aquatic.
Is it the problem that if you start to list them, it becomes more apparent that if there's something that isn't on the list, that you know, whether it's a closed list or an open list and
Indeed,
that kind of issue?
In attempting to provide clarity, you can often cause confusion.
Yeah. I just make the point that some ponds both have ecological value, but as bullet point 9 touches on, a number of them are of importance for recreational use. There's a number of ponds that are used for fishing, quite important ones to the fishing community in the city. So I think it is appropriate that there should be the reference in there. They are valuable features. There's a lot of that section of the population enormously value and want protected.
So I think the policy is dealing specifically with biodiversity, and as a recreational asset, they would be dealt with as part of the open space policy, with GI5, which seeks to protect those existing open spaces, of which some of those ponds of recreational value would be captured.
Thank you both. I'll leave that and move on. Anything else on GI2? I'm going to come to GI2A then. Mr Bewley, shall I come to you first?
I'm happy for you to do so. I don't know if the council wants to say anything.
So you've got the modification in front of you. I'll wait to hear what Mr Bewley says.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. So the question as posed, question 5.3 is, will brackets new, and I emphasise new, policy GI2A and the associated text be effective in protecting Strensall Common SAC? Now, one understands why the question is put in that way in relation to the other policies that are before you today, because, of course, they're not new policies. And so the question for those policies, albeit they may have been modified, is effectively, slightly simplifying, are the policies sound? Whereas the question in relation to this policy is whether the plan is not sound without it. In other words, whether the addition of the policy is necessary for soundness. It's important to focus on that question, we say, and with respect, we say the Council has completely lost sight of that issue. Now, with that point in mind, with that opening point in mind, I want to make essentially 3 points. I'll briefly summarise them and then I'll take you through them slightly more slowly. First point, and the most fundamental point of all, we think, is that simply as a matter of principle and as a matter of logic, as a matter of law, ultimately, it is not and cannot be necessary for soundness or for the legality of the plan, which is what it amounts to add this protective policy. It's a fundamentally different issue, as a matter of logic, from the issue that was before you back in July, among other times, which was whether certain policies had to be deleted. So that's the first point I want to address you on. I'm not going to go through the detail of what we said in July about that, but we'll take that as read. But it's just a fundamentally different question. The second point I want to make is that the only evidence, that point aside, the only evidence base for this new policy is the 2020 HRA. So that's, I think you've just been told, actually, it's document EX-CYC 45. And that doesn't, as I'll show you, without looking at the detail, but just by showing you the function of that document in relation to the SAC, the Strengths Common SAC, that doesn't begin to provide an evidence base for the blanket policy that is now being proposed, which would prevent development anywhere within, residential development, anywhere within 400 metres of the common, of any kind. And thirdly, it's a slightly different point. I want to draw your attention to what amounts to an important concession in the way the new policy is now framed. It's the approach taken to netting off existing residential provision, which we say has quite important implications for how you approach this whole issue. So I'll take those 3 points in turn. First point, then, is the point of principle. Obviously, the proposal to add GI2A, then, is obviously closely interrelated, same basic factual issues, as the issue which we debated back in July, namely whether it was necessary for soundness to delete site allocations ST35 and H59. Now, as you know, and I'm not going to rehash the detail of it, but you've heard about it, DIO strenuously disagrees with the proposed deletion of those allocations, essentially on the basis, without again trying to get into all of the nuances of July, essentially on the basis that it disagrees on the facts. It disagrees, in other words, that upon a detailed assessment of the kind you've heard, that the residential development in those locations cannot occur without the possibility of adverse impacts on the SAC. So that's a factual issue. I'm not going to rehash that factual issue. But although DIO disagrees on that, there is, of course, a measure of agreement at the level of principle in relation to the question of the deletion of those sites. Because we, of course, accept that if we're wrong on the detailed factual assessment, on the merits assessment, so that you can't be satisfied that there wouldn't be adverse impacts on the SAC by reason of the housing development, then the inclusions of the policies would offend the habitats regulations, specifically Regulation 105, and therefore necessarily the policies would have to be deleted for the purposes of soundness, because otherwise the plan would be unlawful. So we accept that kind of basic approach of principle, but we fundamentally reject it in relation to the addition of this new policy. It is not, just as a matter of principle, assume everything I said in July was wrong, everything we've said in our detailed case was wrong. I don't accept it, of course, but assume it. So that you can't be satisfied there won't be adverse impacts by reason of this development. That does not and cannot make it necessary for soundness or for the legality of the plan to add this new policy. Why is that? We'll just take it slightly in stages. First of all, one obviously has to approach this issue on the basis that we've lost, if you like, the factual argument. If we've won the factual argument that we had back in July, so in other words, you're satisfied that the site allocations can be retained because those developments can proceed without adverse impacts on the SAC and to the requisite certainty. Again, we don't need to go back into that. If you're satisfied with that, then this policy, I think, falls away. I take it that must be common ground. So this issue only arises if we've lost that argument, so that at least to the high level of certainty required, you're not satisfied on that issue. And therefore, you have decided that the site allocations are being deleted, or, and if you recall, there's a bit of an issue about this, at least the ST35 allocation, because there's a slight issue about whether H59 can survive by itself. So approach it on that basis. You then ask yourself the question posed in the Habitats Regulation.